Sam get his... Not mine. Oh, not a married man. Don't you know these things? Yeah. Okay, so last week Claire was talking about our Father, and she was talking about what a radical perspective that was for sort of the people in the sort of New Testament time, really, that they didn't really think about God in that way, in that sort of quite intimate way, really. And she was sort of talking a bit about how often our own experience with our own fathers can affect our sort of perspective in terms of how we see God, and she sort of flashed up some of the most common words that people use to describe their fathers, and one of those was distant, and that was the one that really sort of related to me. My father died when I was 3, so I grew up with a very distant idea of what a father was like, because he wasn't really present in my life. And she also talked about the story of the prodigal son, which is a very famous story, obviously, with the younger son going off and partying and wild living before sort of seeing his ways. And when he comes back, obviously they have a celebration. Father has a celebration, and the older son complains. And Nick, if we could have up the first scripture. The older son complains, and the father's response to the son is this: "My son," the father said, "you are always with me. Everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And it really struck me, actually, because I think so often we can live with God every day. The older son was with the father every day, and yet we can sometimes miss what he's actually like. And the verse that really sort of came to mind as Claire was talking was that verse in Psalm 34 where it says, "Taste and see the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him." And here we have the older son, and yet he hadn't really tasted and seen what God was like. And that's what I really felt like was the next step, really, and that's what I wanted to try and do, is sort of build a bit on what Claire was talking about what is God really like. He's our Father, but we need to actually taste and see what he's like, and not just live in the same house as him, like the older son, but really know and experience him, because God is real. Our spiritual journey isn't just something that is sort of intellectual and up here. He is someone who can be experienced. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Taste and see the Lord is good, and sort of a bit about Psalm 34, which is where that verse comes from. But I think for that psalm and that verse, it's really helpful to actually understand the context of it, and the context that David was writing Psalm 34. So David had just killed Goliath. So it was written not long after David had killed Goliath. And what had happened is King Saul, because David had defeated the enemies, had taken David into his household, and David had become friends with Saul's son Jonathan, and Saul actually starts becoming jealous of David's success, and actually it was getting to the point where people were singing that David's success was greater than Saul's success, King Saul's success, and they were saying things like Saul had defeated thousands, but David had defeated tens of thousands. And unsurprisingly, I think I have a little bit of sympathy for Saul, but Saul starts getting a little bit jealous about that, and jealous of David. But that jealousy sort of takes root, and it gets to the point where actually Saul wants to kill David, because he sees David as as a threat. And firstly, you can read about it, but there's this sort of he's trying to marry him off to his daughter, but doing it in such a way that David has to prove himself, and Saul basically hopes that David will get killed in the process. And then he's much more direct, actually, and much more open, and Saul eventually throws a spear at David to try and kill him. So then we have David now running from Saul, and we pick the story up in 1 Samuel 21, and it goes on into 1 Samuel 22. And it says, that day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the door of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. Achish said to his servants, look at that man, he's insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house? So David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. So I think this is really interesting, isn't it? You know, he acts crazy to sort of escape this really difficult situation, and he ends up in this cave, and all of these people, 400 people came, and they were people who were in distress, in debt, or discontented. Now, I don't know how you feel this morning, but I'm fairly sure at least some of you probably feeling a bit discontented. That seems to have come up as a bit of a theme this morning. I suspect some of you are in debt, and you may even have some distress in your life. But those are the people that David ended up gathering around him in this really challenging moment in his life. And these are people, it reminded me of the older brother, again, in that story about the prodigal son. You know, what their attitude was like. You know, that they're discontented. You know, the older brother just wasn't really very happy about life and his position. And these are the sorts of people you get. And then you get David writing Psalm 34. So if we could get that up, please, Nick. And it says, doesn't it, Psalm 34 of David, when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, which is another name for the same name for the same king, who drove him away and he left. So that's why I spent a bit of time talking about that context, because that's when David wrote this psalm, when he'd been run away from the king, and he's got these 400 discontented people around him. And it starts, this is what David says, in that situation, I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. I think he's talking about those 400 people. Glorify the Lord with me. This is what he's saying. Let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears, which which again I think is quite interesting, isn't it? You know, he's in a cave, he's run away, yet he's saying he's been delivered. That's a really interesting perspective on his situation, isn't it? Those who look to him are radiant, their faces are never covered with shame. This poor man called, and the Lord heard him. He saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. We'll carry on with the rest of the psalm a bit later. But again, this is what he's saying, I think, to these people around him, these 400, discontented people. He's saying to them, taste and see the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him, not in the cave, not where they are, but takes refuge in God. And I think the psalm gives some sort of really helpful pointers about what we should do and how we should deal with our distress or our discontent. And it starts, and the first couple of verses are very I-focused, and it always starts with our relationship with God, doesn't it? And that's where David starts. He starts with himself, and he talks about how he will extol the Lord and he will glorify the Lord. But very quickly in verse 2, he through his own relationship with God then begins to draw in those around him, those who are afflicted, hear and rejoice. And verse 3, he then says to them, glorify God with me. Glorify God with me. So, if you're feeling distressed and afflicted, glorify God. Find those who've got that relationship with God and get alongside them and start worshipping with him, because that will help deal with that distress that you might be feeling. And quite interestingly, the sort of pattern repeats, doesn't it? When you get to verse 4, I sought the Lord. So he comes back to the I point. But again, very quickly, he draws in those who are around him, and he talks about looking to God, and he's looking at those around him who've got the trouble. And then you get to that call in verse 8 to those distressed and discontented people. Taste and see the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. And I want to spend a bit of time now just sort of dwelling on this idea of tasting God. I think it's quite an interesting word to use, I think, to taste God. And actually, it just got me a lot thinking about food and drink. I love food and drink. Yeah, I've been on holiday around Europe, had lots of nice meals, enjoying the cuisine and everything. But it is amazing when you start thinking about it, like how central food and drink is to many stories in the Bible, and actually to faith. I mean, Jesus' very first miracle was transforming water into wine, the best wine. And a little aside in that story, Mary says to the servants, "Do as he says." When they're preparing to transform the water into wine, and I think that's great, isn't it? We need to do as he says. But his very first miracle was transforming water into wine. Think about it, he fed 5,000 people, taking food. Actually, he was accused. When the Pharisees were making accusations against Jesus, what they held up against him was that you eat and drink with sinners. Like, that was a really bad thing, eating and drinking with sinners. lots of his parables involve food. We've already talked about the prodigal son with the feasting and the wild partying, but then actually at the end there's another big party in the celebration. There's the story about the man who had the banquet and people wouldn't come, so the poor and the beggars get invited to the banquet. In the Old Testament we have the whole story of the Exodus and God taking them into the promised land. And how was the promised land described? It was a land flowing with milk and honey. The whole system of sacrifice involved killing the fatted calf. You had all sorts of festivals in the Old Testament. You had wine offerings and grain offerings. When they were in the desert, you had manna from heaven, literal food coming from heaven. And obviously, and perhaps the greatest example, is Jesus taking bread and wine as a way of showing it represented his body and his blood. So it seems to me that actually part of our journey with God involves food and eating and drinking. And there's something about the act of eating and drinking and tasting that is a very powerful analogy in terms of how we engage and relate with God. It gives a really strong idea and a strong picture of how we should relate with God. And I know for me, I've been to some great Sunday morning services. I've been to some rubbish Sunday morning services. But I've also had some great times of, not here, in the past. I've also had some great times of spiritual growth where I've just been chatting and talking with people over a dinner table, with friends about life and God. And that's what I think sometimes, it's about, and it's as important that. And there's something about gathering around a table and having food. I love it in Esther. If we could have the next scripture up, Esther 9:22. And we haven't got time to talk about the whole story of Esther, and you might want to go and look at it. But right at the end, it says, it's got this verse. It says, they were to celebrate those days because on those days the Jews got rid of their enemies, and they were also to celebrate that month as the month when their sadness was turned into joy. So there's an instruction there. If you have times where your sadness turns into joy, celebrate. It was a month when their crying was changed into a day of celebration. Mordecai wrote letters to all of the Jews and told them to celebrate these days as a happy day of feasting. They should have parties. I mean, what an instruction. You must have a party. Give gifts to each other and give presents to the poor. And I think that's really powerful. It's not a selfish thing. It's not just a selfish thing. It is about giving out as well and giving to the poor. And while I'm really sort of, emphasising, the food side of it, because it's a bit fun. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's a really good analogy about how our relationship should be with God, and how food. The whole point of food is that it's something that we do regularly. 3 times a day, most people. And it's how we grow, isn't it? It's how we sustain ourselves. And so actually tasting and seeing God, it's how we sustain ourselves. It's how we live how we live with him. In Peter, next one, Nick, please. In Peter it says this. So then stop doing anything to hurt others. Don't lie anymore and stop trying to fool people. Don't be jealous or say bad things about others. Like newborn babies hungry for milk, you should want the pure teaching that feeds your spirit. With it you can grow up and be saved. You have already tasted the goodness of the Lord. And the word taste there is the same word for taste in Psalm 34. But that's what I'm talking about. It's about being hungry for that pure teaching that feeds your spirit. And that's how we grow and be saved. That's what I'm talking about. I did actually look up the word taste in the dictionary, and it's quite a complicated word. It is quite an interesting word. And I found it quite helpful in terms of thinking about how we relate to God. So obviously, the obvious definition is the sense by which the qualities and flavours of a substance are distinguished by the taste buds. So that means, you can tell the difference between chicken and chocolate, for example, and again, when you taste God, can you discern, do you know what God tastes like, as opposed to other things that are not godly in your life? Can you tell the difference when you taste him, between him and other things in your life? Taste, the sensation experienced by means of the taste buds. How does it feel? Is God tasty in your life? Or actually, has he got a bit stale? Do you need to refresh how God tastes in your life? The act of tasting, it's a physical thing. It doesn't just happen. You have to put the food in your mouth. And again, it's the same with God. Sometimes you have to do something very practical. Another definition was that it's a small amount testing, and sometimes we have to do that when God's challenging us. We have to sort of what does this taste like? Do I like this? I could go on. There's loads. 16, and I think I'm on the fourth definition. But it just shows it's very complicated. It's a very complicated word. It's things like, do you have good taste? You start getting to the aesthetics. We use it in those situations as well, don't we? I just want to make a very, very small aside about fasting, actually, because I've really talked about and emphasised the importance of food. And actually, I was just sort of thinking about fasting and the absence of having food. And I was sort of thinking, well, what's all that about then, really? And I think one of the aims of fasting is to remind ourselves that food is not a substitute for God. While it's a very powerful analogy about how we relate to God, it's not a substitute for God. And withholding food sharpens our senses, I think. And Jesus, when he spoke about fasting, he talked about when the story where the disciples couldn't. I've forgotten that they couldn't. Where he says they couldn't. They can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. And it seemed to me that if food is a sign of God's blessing, then in fasting our decision to abstain from that blessing is because we sort of want it transferred. That's what fasting is. It's like we want that blessing that food gives you by abstaining to it. It's like a prayer to God to transfer that blessing to another person. And I think that's one of the things that Jesus is hinting at when he says these things can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. So I just want to then just return to the rest of Psalm 34, just conscious of time. I think we'll read it. So we've just had in So we just had verse 8, which is the taste and see. We just had verse 8, which says, taste and see the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. And then it carries on with, fear the Lord, you his holy people, for those who fear him lack nothing. The lions may grow weak and hungry, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. And I think there, the lions may be the 400 men again. I don't know, but I think it could well be. Come, my children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to blot out their name from the earth. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. He protects all his bones. Not one of them will be broken. Evil will slay the wicked. The foes of the righteous will be condemned. The Lord will rescue his servants. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned. So again, remembering that context for this psalm, those people in distress, in debt, disorientated. David starts to elaborate to them about what they should do to deal with their condition. He tells them to keep their tongue from evil. Another version says avoid saying anything hurtful, which is a real provocation, isn't it? How do you talk to people around you? Make sure you don't you say things that are not hurtful. Don't lie, it says. We need to be honest. Turn from evil. Do good. Do good. Not be good. Do good. Good relationships with people require action. Look for peace, it says. Pursue it. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, didn't he? We have to make the first move. Even when you're right, God knows you're right. So his call is to pursue peace. And that's how you deal with that discontent, rather than sort of wallowing in it. And I really love the last verse where David says, the Lord will rescue his servants. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned. Saul had condemned David, but David's contrasting that with his experience with God. And I just think it's so powerful, isn't it, that David can write this psalm when he's in hiding with these, sort of 400 discontented people, and he's recognising that his sort of physical experience is nothing compared to his relationship with God, and I just think it's a real lesson to us that, like David, that when we're going through tough times, when we're like those perhaps people who gathered round him, when we're in trouble, what are we focusing on? Do we check our position? Do we think about our relationship with God? Do we aim to taste and see that God is good? You're not immune from trouble, but you will be blessed if you take your refuge in him. There you go. So I just think it would be really good if anyone is in that place, that if you would like some prayer, that you make sure that you do that before you leave this morning. We can do that now, or if you're not comfortable sort of doing it in a public way, maybe grab myself or my wife Cara or Claire, and just really get someone to pray for you before you go, because it is a hard place, being in discontent, being, you know, but like David, there are people who will gather around you, be alongside you, and encourage you.
If anyone does, just put your hand up and we can, just don't be quiet, because I think it's a good point.
Yeah. Thanks, Colin. Thanks so much. That's a really good, amazing Bible study on Friday.